Okay. Welcome, Poop Coven, to tonight's episode of the Good Girls Club. If you're watching this on YouTube, hello. If you know Poop Coven lingo, which all of you guys who are watching on YouTube do, the Poop Coven just absolutely gaped me alive. So I'm gonna do my fucking best to not vomit right now. But welcome everybody to the Good Girls Club. We are doing a very special episode of our Manacled. We finally are making it to the end of volume 1. We are gonna read 4 chapters tonight. I am so excited. This is what you've all been waiting for. Yes, hi YouTube, hello our YouTube poops. So again, and I want to, before we even begin getting into everything, Manacled is a fan fiction dark romance surrounding Draco and Hermione from Harry Potter. The world is what would happen if the good guys in the real series of Harry Potter did not win. The trigger warnings are extensive, and they are rape, mutilation, forced marriage, degradation, forced breeding, death, war, and suicide. Viewer discretion is advised. So if you're still listening, here we go. You guys, this is the one we've all been waiting for. Finally getting to the end of volume 1. Manacled is 3 volumes, and the first volume has really been, as Andy said, an uphill battle. So for anyone who is listening and wants a little bit of a summary of what's been going on. So here's the deal. Basically, in this universe, the good guys did not prevail at the end of Deathly Hallows in the OG series. What we have here is, basically, the good guys are decimated and essentially wiped out from the Death Eaters. We find out that all the good guys that we know and love, Harry Potter in particular, all of the Weasleys, Lupin, Tonks, Professor McGonagall, obviously Dumbledore, everybody is exterminated. Our beautiful Hermione was taken and captured towards the end of the war, and she was held in isolation and sensory deprivation for 16 months. During that time, she was also manacled. There was these magical manacles on her wrist that anytime she tried to do magic, it would absorb her magic. And so instead, she sort of internalized her magic, and what she did was she did something called occlumency, where she protected certain areas of memories that were very precious and important to her. But because of that, we find out that she has pretty significant, almost memory loss. Not only did she protect them from other people, legamins, people who can invade the mind and read other people's minds, but she also protected from herself. She can't even remember. Hermione is pulled out of sensory deprivation, and we find out that Voldemort has created, again, trigger warning, Voldemort has created a breeding program, a forced breeding program a la Handmaid's Tale, where basically the female witches are paired with a pure blood wizard to be forcefully impregnated to carry on a pure blood, kind of not necessarily pure blood, but whatever. More witches. Evidently, pure bloods, there's a lot of incest in the witch world, and they are not able to procreate. But we also find out as time goes on that this is really just a ruse. As Voldemort is actually slowly dying, he's trying to kind of deflect attention from that fact that he is weakening to other things. And so that's really what the breeding program is really for. We find out that during the breeding program, all of the women who are under this, which I believe there were 76 witches, are given also very comprehensive brainwashing to make them compliant and accessible. It's terrible. But it also means that the witches, even if they wanted to, they can't act out because they also have magical manacles on their wrists that is blocking them from doing magic, that is also blood bound to the wizard that they are linked with. Hermione is linked with somebody. She is sent off to somebody named the High Reeve. We find out that the High Reeve is no other than Draco Malfoy. So our lovely Hermione, who is experiencing severe PTSD from sensory deprivation, from all the trauma she's endured, she is brought to Malfoy Manor. In Malfoy Manor, we found out that Draco is married to someone named Astoria. Astoria hates Hermione's guts. We'll get into that in a second. Hermione has severe PTSD. She's scared of open spaces. She's having trouble even just walking outside. We also, there's a lot to the story. Again, I highly encourage you, if you want like the comprehensive things, to go back and watch the episodes, but we are watching Hermione slowly remember things, slowly break through her own essentially defense mechanism of protecting her memories. The last 3 chapters were real tough for our Hermione girl. Really tough. So we find out that the other girls that are in the program are being treated, I mean, it's all terrible, but they're being treated really bad. We find out that Draco in some way is doing as little to her as he can, although he is forcibly raping her. I mean, it's mandated by Voldemort. Voldemort also, when monthly, when as long as Hermione's not pregnant, is also using Legamins on her and on Malfoy. So they can't hide anything, essentially. And then the last 3 chapters were tough. Hermione was attacked by someone named Montague. We find out that Draco ripped Montague's guts out because he attacked Hermione, outing himself as the High Reeve, which was like a really big thing. He had kept that he was a High Reeve private from the rest of the world up until he basically blatantly ripped out Montague's guts in front of everybody. The next chapter, our beautiful Hermione also gets attacked by Draco's wife, Astoria, and Astoria almost rips out Hermione's eyeball. She ends up being okay, but really, really rough because Astoria is just completely addled with jealousy because she sees how much Draco is taking care of Hermione, how before Hermione was in Malfoy Manor, Draco was never there, never in that house. And then all of a sudden, Hermione's there and Draco is never left her side. We also, are then told that Hermione and Draco need to have sex that's more intimate. He was kind of essentially, quote unquote, raping her very clinically, if you can do such a thing, and they are not successfully getting pregnant. So they were forced to sort of have more intimate relations, and those relations are slowly breaking Hermione's memories open. She's remembering things. Some of the really big memories she remembers is about Ginny. There's a lot that comes back to Ginny in her memories. We also, one of the most important things you should know about Hermione in this world is she is a healer. She's not just a healer, she's the most badass healer that like pretty much has ever walked the face of the earth. She was sent away for years to study to become a healer, to become a potions mistress. During that time, really Harry and Ron became very closely bonded, even more so than in the OG books. And she felt sort of isolated, and she also sees the war from a different perspective than the rest of the good guys. The good guys refuse to do dark magic. Hermione sees as a healer only the results of what dark magic does to a human being. This agony, the screaming, the wailing before death. And so she's the only one in the Order of Phoenix pleading with them to use dark magic. Everyone else is ignoring her. So right now, this is... I know. Good night, Hunter. I know a lot to take in. As we work through the books, the summaries, I know I can't be as comprehensive as I would like. But again, the entire volume 1 is on, so far, is all on YouTube. So if you'd like to catch up and know what all the little details are, go to YouTube, go to the Good Girls Club playlist. All the episodes are there, including this one will be there after tonight. So without further ado, what we have long waited for. So this is going to be the final chapters of volume 1, which is really exciting. Oh, fuck. Oh my God. Oh, okay. So here we go. So this is the final chapters of volume 1. Again, reminder, please heed the trigger warnings. So we will be reading chapter 22, chapter 23, chapter 24, and 25 today. So here we go. Chapter 22. The next morning, Hermione dragged herself from bed and into the bathroom down the hall with a shower. The hot water beating down and radiating around her was the closest thing to physical comfort that she had access to. She closed her eyes and stayed there, eventually sinking down onto the floor and hugging her knees as she squeezed her eyes shut and tried not to think about the previous night. She focused on her shower. One of the most underappreciated aspects of magic was the never-ending supply of hot water. The temperature never faltered or ran out. It just streamed down upon her. If she stayed there for an entire day, the water would still come out hot. When she finally forced herself to turn off the taps and climb out, She stood in the middle of the steamy bathroom, trying to summon the willpower to dry off and dress. She had never felt so unmotivated. Existing seemed like such an unfair demand. Hermione would give anything for a book, anything to read, but the news. She was sick of the news. Perhaps she would go for a walk. She hadn't been outside since the equinox. She didn't know if she was ever going to be able to go near the hedges again, but perhaps she could manage a walk along one of the lanes. She could inspect the buds of the trees, count daffodils, something. She walked out of the bathroom and went down the icy hallway wrapped in a towel. Back in her room, she went over to the wardrobe to pull on a fresh set of robes. Laying them out on the bed, and she dropped the towel and surveyed herself. The remaining scars from Montague had all faded entirely. There was a spot on the inside of her right breast that still felt scarred in the tissue. Hermione ran her fingers over it thoughtfully. It had been so deep, it probably should have required a more specific healing charm. The area felt taut. It had been deep enough that the damaged tissue was not just dermal. Typical healing charms were designed for skin and muscle repair. There was probably a specific spell for repairing mammary tissue, but Hermione couldn't remember it off the top of her head. She closed her eyes and tried to think back and see if she could remember learning it. She could remember a large book of healing spells. She carried it with her constantly for several years, shrunk to fit in her pockets, always on hand, stained with blood and potions that spilled and sank into the pages when she was too busy to charm them away in time. Dog-eared to the most important sections. So many dog-eared pages, crammed with her notes in the margins. It had been the first thing she bought after Dumbledore died. She remembered the large owl that flew into the Great Hall of Hogwarts and dropped it for her. Everyone else had been talking about restarting DA, buying books on defense magic, but Hermione had turned to healing. It had been the start of the schism, the space that slowly grew between herself and everyone else her age within the Resistance. While they had been drilling shield charms and stunners, she had gone to Madame Pomfrey and asked for an apprenticeship. She spent most of her days with Madame Pomfrey, memorizing every healing spell and advanced diagnostic charms the school matron could teach, learning which signs and symptoms to look out for. Healing spell work was highly precise, subtle. It required the ability to filter out distractions and focus, to channel magic with extremely delicate nuance, determine the proper spell, perfect the inflection, and then funnel down one intentions with precision. Healers didn't use physical scalpels, but magically speaking, the mental exactitude and wand work was comparable. Hermione had memorized diagram after diagram of human anatomy, drilling herself on all the details she needed to train her eyes to pick up in a diagnostic, puzzle pieces of information that had been assembled in order to identify what might be wrong. Then in the evening, she'd head to the dungeons to study potions with Snape. When she had finished the healing and potions, she would sequester herself into the corner of the library, rifling through book after book in search of useful spell work for Harry, until she'd fall asleep there. Slowly, she had drifted away from her friends. They were also righteously angry and yet optimistic following Dumbledore's death. There was a fire of certainty driving them that Hermione couldn't seem to spark within herself, even at the very beginning. The more she learned, the more her confidence regarding the outcome of the war seemed to wane. No one else seemed to appreciate how hard it was to keep people alive. When she failed to share the optimism, it offended them. She was Harry's friend. Why wouldn't she believe in him? Why was she so determined to make everyone feel scared? Did she think she was smarter than them? She couldn't even cast a Patronus anymore. Maybe if she spent more time practicing her defense spells, she'd stop being so morbid. It wasn't that they weren't taking the war seriously, but that their perspective was narrowed. It was light versus darkness, good versus evil. Light always won. Look at the stories, look at the history books. Yes, some people would die, but it would be for the cause, a worthy death. They weren't afraid to die for that. Eventually, Hermione had stopped talking and withdrew with her books. There was no point in noting that history books were written by the victors, or that there were plenty of wars in the Muggle world where lives were just another form of ammunition. where battles failed to mean anything or produce more than a new list of casualties, a fresh row of graves. Maybe they all needed to believe such things, but Hermione couldn't. She needed to prepare. She buried herself in healing, in potions, in books, until the Ministry of Magic fell and the war officially began. Then she'd been rushed off to begin studying in France, then Albania, when France became too dangerous, then Denmark, then Austria? No. Had there been somewhere else before she went to Austria? It felt like there was a gap, a blur. Hermione pushed at the blank space in her memory. Somewhere else she'd gone to study. Where could it have been? Why would she forget it? She forced her mind toward the blur, but it was just dimness, a low golden light emanating from a lamp, dust, the scent of old paper, dry and green, and the thin chain of a necklace in her hands. Nothing else. She pressed harder, but the memory faded into the back of her mind again. She couldn't remember anything anymore. Just like she couldn't recall the spell for repairing mammary tissue. She sighed to herself as fingers fell away from the knotted tissue. The faultiness of her memory was increasingly unnerving. Sometimes she wasn't even sure she knew who she had been during the war. She remembered herself as a healer, just a healer and a potion mistress. At some point, she had diverged from that person, and she didn't know how or when it had happened. When had she become someone that Voldemort would describe as dangerous? A person who leveled half a prison, who burned Dementors, and stabbed Graham Montague with poisoned knives? Hermione had no idea where that version of herself could have come from. She found it difficult to believe the person had ever existed. Somehow, that mysterious person had been swallowed up in the darkness beneath Hogwarts. Without the secondhand accounts of Voldemort, Malfoy, and Montague, she would never have even known such a person had existed. She almost would think it was some sort of deception if she didn't have so many scars she couldn't account for. She glanced down at her left wrist, ran her fingertips over the scattered silvery scars that mottled her sternum and collarbones, and then traced along the long, thin scar between her 7th and 8th ribs. Healer Stroud had said that the fugues in her mind weren't a dissociation or multiple personalities, but Hermione rather felt that they must be. Hermione, as she knew herself to be, would never have leveled half a prison and killed countless other people in order to break in. Not even for Ginny. Hermione wouldn't have treated everyone else as collateral damage in a rescue attempt. She didn't know how a sky filled with burning Dementors. She had never carried poisoned knives, much less learned how to stab anyone with them. There was something cavernous in her ignorance, and she didn't know how to and she didn't know how to reconcile it. She pulled on her robes, went downstairs, and wavered at the veranda door. The air was warm and smelled loamy, and the faint traces of sweetness. There was huge beds of daffodils and irises that had seemingly sprung up in the previous 2 weeks. The birds were singing. It was as though the outside world had transformed itself while Hermione had been laying in her darkened room. Nature had dropped its shroud and stopped mirroring the coldness and gloom of Hermione's life. The world had left her behind. It had sprung to life again, but Hermione was still trapped in a cage, cold and deathly. She turned and walked back inside. She didn't want to feel the stirring of spring, not on her skin or in her blood. She didn't want to think about life stirring, not around her, not inside her. Topsy appeared before dinner. "You is ready now?" the house elf squeaked. It was hours earlier than Malfoy had ever come before. Hermione had no idea that could possibly be the reason for the change. Every bit of added unpredictability only made it worse. She went cold with dread. She went in the bathroom and bathed. As she toweled off with shaking hands, she remembered the potions Healer Stroud had sent. She'd been so nervous the night before, she'd forgotten them. After dressing, she went and pulled one of the vials out of the bathroom cabinet. It was a draught of peace. The color and consistency were unfamiliar. She sniffed it. The scent was tangy in her nostrils, slightly citrus and peppery. She put a drop on her fingertip and tasted it. It was warm and mildly sweet on the tongue. She waited a minute. She felt less cold with anxiety. She swallowed it, and it was hot, sliding down her throat. As it reached her stomach, the heat seemed to bloom outward through her whole body. Her skin tingled and grew almost achingly sensitive. Hermione froze, gasped with horror, and lurched forwards, staring wide-eyed in the mirror. Her cheeks were flushed, and her eyes were dilated as she studied her reflection. She pressed her hands over her mouth and stumbled back. Stroud had given her a lust potion. Hermione wanted to burst into tears as she tried to steady herself and will away the effects of the potion currently burning through her. This couldn't be happening. It was just boundlessly cruel. Hermione's hands were shaking as she tried to think of some solution, some way to neutralize it. She snatched up the cup from beside the sink and gulped glass after glass of water in the hope of flushing it from her system. It didn't work. The heat through her body seemed to be dropping lower, beginning to radiate from her lower abdomen. She walked into her room. She couldn't understand why Stroud would do this. Punishing Malfoy for whatever interference he had made in the breeding program was one thing, but tricking Hermione into dosing herself with a lust potion was a whole new level of callousness. Hermione climbed unsteadily onto her bed, laid back and closed her eyes. If she just held still and focused, it might be all right. The click of the door made her flinch. She opened her eyes and found Malfoy standing there, cold and tense, as he unclasped his outer robes and shrugged them off his shoulders. He was studying her as he crossed the room, draped the clothing over the edge of the bed and stared down at her. "Do you want another calming draught?" he said. It was possible a calming draught would help. Hermione calculated. It might ease the physical reaction her body was burning with. She gave a sharp nod and sat up. As she took the vial from his hand, their fingers brushed and she bit her tongue to keep from gasping. She unstoppered it and gulped it down while Malfoy knocked back his own potion. The draught of peace had worsened effect. Rather than ease the symptoms, it made her body relax further into them. She dropped the vial onto the bed as she tried to hand it back. She covered her mouth with her hands and burst into tears. Malfoy stared at her for a moment. "What's wrong?" he demanded. "Healer Stroud sent us set of potions that she said would make things easier," she said, smearing away the tears and staring determinedly down at the covers on the bed. "I forgot about it yesterday, but I took it tonight, just before you arrived. I thought it would be for anxiety. That's what it seemed like when I tested a drop. It's not like I could do spell analysis, so I took it. But," she choked slightly, "it was an aphrodisiac." There was a stunned silence. "You are an idiot," Malfoy finally said. "Do you just swallow anything without asking questions?" Hermione flinched. "Last time I asked you to identify a potion sent to me, you forced it down my throat out of sheer spite. Was I supposed to assume it would be different with you this time?" Malfoy was silent. The rage emanating from him was palpable, like heat waves around a flame. The air almost seemed to distort around the edges of his body as he stood there, glaring down at her. "You are an idiot," he said again. Hermione wanted to curl in on herself like a ball. The heat in her core was distractingly steady, and her whole body felt too warm and sensitive. She felt hollow inside. She wanted to be touched. No one had touched her in so long. No, no, no. She took a deep, shuddering breath. "Can't you wait and do it later tonight? I'm sure it'll wear off after a few hours." "I can't. I've suddenly been required in France tonight. That's why I came here early. I won't be back to the manor until late tomorrow," Malfoy said. Hermione gave a small sob. "Fine," she choked and forced herself to lay back down onto the bed. "Just do it." She squeezed her eyes shut and tried to focus on counting backward from 1,000 by doubling the subtracted number each time. -1, 999. -2, 997. -4, 993. -8, 985. She felt Malfoy pushing her robes aside and shivered. -16. 979. Minus 32. Malfoy's fingers near her core abruptly shredded her concentration, and she let out a smothered moan as her eyes snapped open. Malfoy was looking down at her with wide, horrified eyes. She stared at him. She had never really seen him as someone sexual before. Despite 5 months of having him bend her over a table, the sexual aspect of him had never really registered. He was cold and dangerous. Beautiful, but only in aesthetic, like a marble statue. Not something hot-blooded. Not something she wanted any kind of physical contact from. She had never, ever wanted to be touched by him in any sort of way. Now she wanted to feel his lips against her. To feel his hands on her. The weight of him that she'd been so desperate to escape from the night before, she wanted to feel it. To have him bearing down on her, pressing into her. The burn of arousal in her core was mind-numbing. She had never felt the need to have something inside her before, but as she lay there, she felt ready to scream if he didn't touch her. She hadn't thought the second night could possibly be worse than the first, but this was 1,000 times worse. She forced her eyes shut again so that she stopped studying his face, stopped taking in all the details of him that she'd never cared to take note of before. His hair and sharp cheekbones, the intensity of his eyes, his thin lips and straight white teeth, the precise lines of his jaw, and his pale throat disappearing just in the black collar of his shirt. Just move, she said, and nearly sobbed with the effort it took not to just move herself. A moment later, she felt him prod and slide into her, and she immediately canted her hips forward to take him deeper. She buried her face in her hands and tried to tear her mind away while she gasped against her palms and felt ruined. She was shaking. All she could think of was how much she wanted him to move, hard and fast. Whimpers kept forming in her throat, and she couldn't smother them. She held herself so rigidly, her entire body shuddered as she tried not to allow any kind of reaction. The coil of want was drawing up tighter and tighter inside of her. She bit her lips together. She wouldn't give in. She just needed to hold out. He'd come soon and it would be over. Then she could leave the potion to burn itself out in her system. His thrusts were becoming longer and harsher the way they did as he reached the end. He sped up slightly, and she bit down hard on her tongue as she tried to keep hold. And then she broke with a despairing sob. Her whole body spasmed around him. She could feel herself clenching and seizing as he thrust into her a few more times, and then he shuddered with a tortured groan. After a moment, he jerked away, and she barely opened her eyes in time to see him snatch his robes off the bed and then apparate straight out of the room. She caught a glimpse of his face before he vanished. He looked gray, as though he were going to faint. She lay there on the bed and cried as her head slowly cleared. Reality, bitter as poison, started slowly bleeding into her as she absorbed what had just happened. She had just had the first orgasm she has had any memory of. She didn't know if she'd been a virgin before she was sent to Malfoy. If she hadn't been, the loss of it was one of the many details that had vanished from her mind. It seemed like an odd thing to have chosen to protect. So, most likely, she hadn't had sex during the war. Everything felt foreign. Nothing had given her any indication that such things were something her body had been familiar with. The lust potion had altered things. Permanently, she feared. Awakened her body to a new aspect of these physical invasions that had previously lain dormant. Hermione lay unmoving for 10 minutes. When the time finally elapsed, she got up and went into the bathroom. She pulled out every remaining vial of potion and poured them down the sink before dropping the vials into the bin. When she looked up, the portrait was there, watching her in the mirror, always watching, always silent. Hermione gave her a bitter smile and then slumped to the ground. The pale young witch stared at Hermione. Hermione felt cold, as though she were going into shock. She curled up into a tight ball, hugging her knees and trying to breathe. She was going to go mad. She was going to go mad. She couldn't keep holding on. She didn't even know why she was holding on, why she hadn't just let herself go while she was locked under Hogwarts. Malfoy Manor was worse. She buried her face in her hands. She could feel the fluids from herself and Malfoy on her thighs. She fell asleep on the floor. That is the end of chapter 22. We're almost there, Poop Coven. So close. That is the end of chapter 22. We are beginning chapter 23. And this is in italics. So if I go like this, remember it's either a dream sequence or something that's not happening currently. So just, okay. 23. Chapter 23. Hermione was standing in the kitchen of Spinner's End. She turned slowly, looking over the surfaces covered with notebooks, prepared ingredients, and bubbling potions. Hermione paused as she noticed one potion shimmering in the corner. She stepped over and watched the spiraling steam rising from the surface. She sniffed it superstitiously. The spicy, earthy scent of oak moss, smoky undertones of cedar, the bruised scent of oxidizing leaves, and parchment. No. She sniffed again. Papyrus. She stepped abruptly away and glanced at the other surrounding cauldrons. This is quite a variety of love potions you're brewing, she said, looking over to where Severus was stooped over a simmering cauldron. A new project for the Dark Lord. He suddenly developed an interest in trying to weaponize it, Severus said, sneering down at the murky, luminescent liquid he was working over. Hermione felt her blood run cold. Is that a possibility? Severus shrugged with a faint smile. I am both skeptical and unmotivated, so most likely not. I believe it was more of a passing notion than anything he has a sincere interest in. I was drawing up a comprehensive report to present in case he asked me about it, and I'm doing it in my home rather than in the lab to ensure no one offers any groundbreaking ideas. Hermione surveyed the room. There were 10 varieties of love potions and a few aphrodisiacs she recognized, as well as an additional 15 that appeared experimental. What would constitute as a weaponized love potion? Something of exceptional power that doesn't require redosage. I believe he imagines himself using it for interrogations. That's obscene, Hermione finally said. Indeed. Fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, he has other matters he regards as more urgent for Sussex to focus on. We are out of the memory. Hermione woke, still lying on the cold floor of the bathroom. She continued to lie there. There was an upside to her depression. It was that it made sleeping easier. It was though her body had given up. The rage she spent months cultivating had melted away, and she was left tired and listless as though her body weighed too much to even carry across the floor. She could sleep and sleep in a state of despair for most of the day. She pushed herself off the floor, went to her room, and climbed under the covers of her bed, burrowing into them and hugging them around herself. Even her brain felt tired and listless, as though even thinking took too much out of her. She glanced over at the clock. It was nearly 9 o'clock in the evening. There was a tray with dinner on the bedside, beside the chair, but Hermione had no appetite. She wondered why Malfoy was in France. Presumably, it was to kill more people. Would he still be masked, or would he do it openly? She wondered what he looked like when he cast the killing curse. Most people's faces screwed up in a revolting grimace when they cast the killing curse. Even Voldemort. But Malfoy's hatred and fury was so cold. Perhaps he looked the way he did when he had killed Montague. Hermione wondered if getting exposed as the High Reeve were intentional. If Malfoy were moving to seize power from Voldemort. He needed to be known and feared. Being revealed as had been a calculated risk, perhaps, banking on Voldemort's need for a public figure to spare his life. And things were in Romania were as unstable as had been implied. Voldemort couldn't kill Malfoy now, even if he wanted to. It would leave a power vacuum, destabilize the entire Death Eater army, and give Europe the opportunity to break free. There were no other figures in Voldemort's army that were even vaguely comparable. Voldemort had local government figures, but Malfoy was Voldemort's only visible crutch on a continental level. The most powerful general in the Lord's army was what Astoria had said. A general for years. That was what Malfoy had said about himself. Hermione paused, puzzled. Malfoy had been a general during the war? She didn't remember Malfoy being a general. She didn't remember much of anything about him after Dumbledore died. She'd assumed his ascendance in rank had occurred at the end of the war, but perhaps that had been wrong. It had been hard to get good information toward the end of the war. Hermione hadn't been included in most of the specifically strategic order meetings. It must have been a detail she'd missed. There were so many things Malfoy that felt incomprehensible. His power, the point of his ambition, his ironic talent for healing, his operating ability, a ritual intended as a punishment. Hermione turned over the mystery in her mind. It was probably what Voldemort had been referencing to. He'd spoken of Malfoy deeply disappointing him. Hermione wondered on what earth it could be. Dark magic rituals were generally physically corrosive and mentally eroding. Malfoy seemed suspiciously, even unnaturally, intact. In fact, as she thought about it further, Malfoy was impossibly sane. With the quantity of dark magic he was exposed to, both through his own use and Voldemort's, he should be poisoned by it. Unless he was spending all of his time undergoing purification rituals, his relative health seemed impossible. Hermione had been ill just from entering Voldemort's hall, while Malfoy had seemed entirely indifferent to it, and he surely went there multiple times a week. People didn't become indifferent to dark magic. It was like a poisonous drug, addicting, affecting, deadly. Dark wizards tended to use more and stronger types of dark arts until they eroded themselves away, the way Voldemort was, or went mad the way Lucius and Bellatrix had. But Malfoy was intact. Physically and mentally, he was pristine and capable of operating across an entire continent. How on earth was that possible? Hermione kept turning the question over and over until she finally gave up. She had too little information to enable any guesses. She moved on to a different problem. She couldn't figure out how she fit in. Whatever Malfoy's scheme was, it seemed like she must be somehow included in it. Malfoy was too devoted to her care and maintenance for it to be otherwise. Hermione had thought it was simply because he was doing it as ordered, but she was beginning to strongly suspect his attention was beyond that. He seemed personally and emotionally invested in her. The way he stared at her, the undivided intensity of it was almost undeniable. She was significant to him or to his plans. Where did not getting Hermione pregnant fit into the strategy? He hated raping her, didn't appear to enjoy it at all, and didn't try to. It made him ill. So, wouldn't he want her pregnant as soon as possible? Unless it had to do with her memories. The idea that a pregnancy would unlock the memories was theoretical at best. But if Malfoy suspected there was something in her memory that he didn't want unlocked, could that possibly explain it? But even without a pregnancy, the memories were slowly beginning to reemerge. If she were pregnant, it would buy him 9 months of exclusive access to them. So long as she was not pregnant, arbitrary memories might emerge for Voldemort to find. Why would he keep forcing them both through 5 days of monthly trauma? Hermione couldn't account for it. She mulled over the question again and again. The only additional element she could think of was that Malfoy had to know she would rather die than get pregnant. Would that matter to him? She kept wondering until she fell asleep. She was anxious all the next day, on edge and fidgeting until she started fearing she started picking her skin off. She barely skimmed the Daily Prophet before she began tearing it to pieces and folding it into every shape she could think of. She couldn't fold cranes, but she could fold aeroplanes and all sorts of other geometric shapes. She poured her nervous energy into folding until her fingertips went raw. She started walking through the north wing, trailing her fingers lightly along the walls as she went. When evening came, Hermione took a bath without instruction. Topsy did not appear, but dinner did. Hermione ignored it. It was nearly 9 when the house elf suddenly popped into the room. Topsy averted her eyes as Hermione stared down at her. "The master is back. You is to get ready." There was a pause. "I am ready. I am already ready," Hermione said. Topsy nodded and then disappeared. Hermione went and sat at the foot of her bed. When Malfoy appeared at the door, they stared across the room at each other for several minutes. There was nothing to say. He walked across the room and withdrew a vial of calming draught, which he handed to her without a word. She swallowed the contents and then handed it back. While he was taking his own potion, Hermione slid back on the mattress and laid down, staring determinedly up at the canopy over the bed. She didn't flinch when she felt the bed shift. She didn't make a sound when she felt him shift her robes aside and expose her. When she felt him move between her legs, she bit her lip as she continued to stare up at the canopy. When he muttered the lubrication charm, she balled her hands into fists. When he entered her, she gave a sharp gasp and then turned her face toward the wall in despair, writhing with internal anguish. Her body had anticipated it, attuned and waiting. It was ready, wanting. It was such a profound betrayal. Knowing her arousal was physiologically natural didn't ease the guilt. When the rape was clinical, it was endurable. When the rape was drugged, it was endurable. When it was just her own mind and physiology, it was the worst of all. It twisted and tore at something inside her. "I'm being raped and my body is enjoying it," she thought bitterly and wanted to curl away. She thought she might just vomit. She didn't want to know if Malfoy could tell the difference, whether he knew. She stared at the wall and tried not to make another sound. When he came, he immediately removed himself, jerked her robes down, snatched up his robes, and apparated. She didn't turn to see what he looked like before he vanished. She just pulled her legs closed and lay there. She could feel her tears leaving cold trails along her temples. The next 2 days were the same. There was little sense of relief the morning after the 5th day. Hermione just felt cold. Her room and bed had lost all sense of comfort to her. She pulled a fresh set of robes from the wardrobe and went down the hall to the bathroom with the shower. Then she curled up into a tight ball, seated on the floor of the shower, and stayed there under the water. There was no point in denying it. Things had shifted. Nothing felt the same. Not any longer. The potion was a significant factor, but Hermione couldn't deny the array of other elements. Malfoy was not the monster she had initially perceived him as being. After learning what was happening to the other surrogates, after what Montague had tried to do to her, after Astoria, after becoming terrified what cruelty Lucius Malfoy would devise if her surrogacy were transferred, the person she perceived Malfoy as being had shifted. Being saved by him had affected things. He touched her. No one had touched her in so long. He'd healed her far more than he needed to. He didn't even want to rape her, though he insisted his protection of her was entirely born from self-interest because he'd been commanded to. She was almost certain he was far exceeding what obligation demanded. The influence of the Manacles had also contributed to it. They had always been intended to cultivate compliance and dependence, to remove her ability to resist. If she could resist Malfoy's violation, if he were physically forcing her down as he raped her, it would be easier for her to stop growing resigned and accustomed to it. It was the lying quietly and experiencing it, the anticipation of the inevitability that she had no ability to resist. It was the ways he hurt her were more voluntary and less obligatory. It would be easier to see him for who he was. Although, even then, the mind was cruelly adaptive. The subconscious will survive was written into humans more deeply than almost anything else. Survival did not require Hermione to be intact, to be decent, to be herself. Survival would carve away any part of her that made enduring harder. It would smooth away the mental anguish, latch onto every glimmer of kindness. It would make life cease to ache. If she weren't careful, it would steal away every bit of her until she was so broken inside that she would accept her cage. Hermione shivered beneath the scalding water still beating down on her. She needed to stay away from Malfoy. She couldn't talk to him. She wouldn't let herself ask him questions. If he asked her something, she would answer as briefly as possible. She would stop engaging with him, stop trying to understand him. She might not be able to control what her body did, but she could control her mind. Anything he wanted from her, he would have to force from her. She dropped her head down on her knees as a sense of desolation came over her. She was so tired of being all alone. She pressed her lips together as she struggled against crying. Even her memory was a lonely abyss. Almost all the years of war had been alone. Studying alone in Hogwarts, then studying in Europe. There had been no time for anything but professional relationships. When she returned, she'd practically lived in the hospital ward. There was never time for friendships. When she had any spare time, Harry and Ron were gone on missions. When they were back, it was generally in the aftermath of a battle, when Hermione's skills had been most urgently needed. She had so few memories of being with either of them in a non-professional circumstances. Then, after the final battle, Hermione's imprisonment under Hogwarts had been like an endless fall. Alone, 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 until Hermione's memory had cannibalized itself. When Hermione had finally been dragged out and forced into the breeding program, she had become reduced to her function. To Healer Stroud, she was a womb. To Voldemort, she was a potential source of war intelligence. She was not a person, not to anyone except Malfoy. He treated her like a person. He answered most of her questions, and he looked at her as though he saw her. He talked to her. He treated her as though she personally were significant to him. When he hurt her, it always seemed forced and unwilling. Everyone else just hurt her because they could. Even the house elves would barely look at her. There was no work to bury herself into in Malfoy Manor. No endless void to become lost in. It was just Hermione, sitting and wondering and folding paper, trapped in a cold house. Malfoy was the only bit of warmth or life or human contact she had. Whether he had intended it or not, Hermione was latching onto him in her desperate isolation. She couldn't. He had killed everyone. He had murdered or executed them all. Willing or not, he was raping her. She was just a pawn to him. She wasn't going to betray her friend's memories in such a horrific manner. She wasn't going to betray herself. If she died in Malfoy Manor, she would do so clinging to the bits of herself that remained. Like death itself, Malfoy had stolen everything away from her, and he was waiting to take more. She could stay away from Malfoy. She could refuse to engage unless he forced and coerced her. She could, and she would. She was used to being alone. She spent the rest of the day resolving herself, bracing herself. Malfoy was due for another legamancy session. He always came after her fertile window. When he did, he would find all the thoughts in her head. He would probably taunt her. She wouldn't respond. She spent the afternoon building a card tower. The day passed. Dinner came. Malfoy did not. Hermione tried not to be anxious. She tried not to keep glancing at the clock. She ignored the tightening sensation in her chest as she kept expecting him to appear. He was probably doing it on purpose, she reminded herself. Perhaps he had been reading her mind when she had been thinking earlier. He was probably torturing her intentionally. She kept expecting him to eventually appear until it was past 11, when Hermione usually was asleep. Finally, she went to bed. She couldn't sleep. She just lay there, wondering why he hadn't come. Maybe he was traveling again. The newspaper hadn't said anything, but perhaps he still was. Maybe he was out with a story at some event. Hermione didn't think she remembered anything being mentioned in the society pages. Maybe they'd gone to dinner. Did he and Astoria go to dinner together? Hermione lay in bed wondering until the clock on the wall indicated it was nearly 2 a.m. She got out of bed. There was a nearly full moon. She went to the door and left her room, wandering through the moonlight hallways of the north wing. The portrait followed her like a pale wraith. Hermione's fingers trailed along walls as she walked. She never had panic attacks inside the manor, but the sensation of the wall beneath her fingers was steadying. The moonlight cast long, sharp shadows across the floor and walls. A thought abruptly struck Hermione. What if Malfoy died? Would she even know? Probably not. Not for days. Healer Stroud would come and take Hermione to be transferred to some other Legamins. Maybe Voldemort would bring Snape back from Romania and order him to impregnate her instead. What if she were already pregnant? The thought made her cold. What if she were pregnant and Malfoy died? Would Voldemort wait for her to give birth and drag her memories out himself? Or would he make Stroud abort the baby so Hermione could be transferred? If she carried it to term then, what would happen to it? Would Voldemort give the baby to Astoria? Astoria would kill it. She'd torture it to death. If it looked like Malfoy and Hermione, Astoria would probably tear its eyes out and burn it, starve it to death. Hermione gasped and started hyperventilating in the hallway. There was nothing she could do. Nothing. She couldn't do anything. She'd spent months wishing Malfoy would die, but now the thought filled her with terror. What if he was dead? She kept breathing faster and faster. Her hands and arms started prickling as though they were needles grazing her skin. Her chest felt compressed as though she were being crushed. She couldn't make herself calm down. Suddenly, there was a shifting in the darkness. Hermione froze, choked down a gasp, and glanced around. Malfoy stepped out of the darkness. She was certain he hadn't been there a moment before. The moonlight caught his pale hair and skin. He looked terrifying and angelic at the same time. She stared at him, feeling her initial panic fade away. He wasn't dead or dying. The sense of relief she felt at seeing him. She tried not to dwell on it as she studied him carefully. There was something about his face. The tension in it seemed slightly eased from the hard, cold expression she was so used to. He looked less on the verge of a breakdown. He came closer to her, his eyes traveling down her slowly as he sized her up. Granger. Her name rolled from his lips like a purr. She felt a shiver of uncertainty pass through her. He never called her by her surname. Not once since she had arrived. She was always Mudblood. Her eyes widened. He was drunk. His steps remained steady, and his voice was unslurred, but she was sure of it. She didn't move. He drew near until she shuffled backwards, but he kept coming closer, until she was trapped against the wall, and he was mere inches from her. Oh, Granger, he sighed, staring down at her. He raised a hand and placed it across her throat, but didn't squeeze. He just left it there. She could feel the heat of it seeping into her skin. She stared up at him. Even drunk, his expression was a mask. She wasn't sure what he intended to do next. He slid his thumb lightly along her neck, and she felt her skin prickle. He sighed again. If I'd known what pain you'd cause me, I never would have taken you. He just stood there, holding her throat. She could feel her pulse fluttering against his hand. She wasn't sure what he meant. If she was supposed to apologize? She could smell the alcohol on his breath. But, he said after a moment, at this point, I suppose I deserve to burn. I wonder if you'll burn too. His face was suddenly close to hers. She could feel the air from his words brushing against her lips. His lips crashed into hers. That is the end of chapter 23. We're close, guys. We're closing in. That is the end of chapter 23. Here we go. Chapter 24. Chapter 24. We have 24 and 25. We can do it. Chapter 24. Just remember, this is more complicated than you can ever imagine. Do not think I'd read you something so basic as a Stockholm Syndrome. Chapter 24. He tasted a fire whiskey. It was a punishing kiss. The moment their lips touched, he crushed her body against his. His hand on her throat slid back and up to the nape, tangling his fingers in her hair as he deepened the kiss. His other hand reached up and cradled her cheek in the palm of his hand for a moment before it slipped down along her body. He angled her head up as he kept kissing her, his tongue pushing into her mouth before withdrawing as he nipped her lips, hard enough to hurt but not to bleed. Then, when she was gasping for breath, he pulled his mouth away and started kissing along her throat. Hermione was frozen in shock, pliant and stunned in his possessive hands. He was pulling at her clothes. She could feel the outer robe slipping onto the floor and the top buttons of the dress open as the cold manor air hit her. He ripped buttons off her as he exposed her and explored her bared skin. He was grinding himself against her as he pulled the dress down over her shoulders, stripping her to the waist. The cold air bit against her skin, and she felt her nipples harden in the cold as his hands darted up to palm her breasts and tease her. His mouth was at the juncture of her neck and shoulder, and he was kissing and nipping his way along it when suddenly he reached a spot and she moaned. They both froze. Malfoy wrenched himself away. He stood there looking at her. She was slumped against the wall, half stripped and aroused. His eyes were wide, as though he'd just become aware of himself. He stayed there looking shocked for several moments before the mask suddenly clicked back into place. His face grew hard and he smirked. "Apparently, you have accepted your place," he said with a leer. Then he turned on his heel and vanished into the darkness. Hermione stayed there in shock. She felt frozen as a cold sense of devastation crept over her. She had been receptive to Malfoy. Her pliancy hadn't been enforced by the manacles. It hadn't even occurred to her to push him away. It hadn't occurred to her to want to. He'd kissed her and she'd let him. She hadn't felt repulsed. It had thrilled something lonely and aching inside of her, being touched. Someone was with warm hands caressing her. It was a longing laced right through the very fiber of her. Trapped in the manor, she was latching on to any scrap of kindness she could find. But it wasn't kindness. Malfoy wasn't kind. He simply wasn't cruel. He wasn't as awful as he could be. He possessed the meagerest shreds of decency. Apparently, in her fracturing mind, an absence of cruelty was sufficient solace. For her starved heart, it was enough. A strangled sob tore itself from her, and she gathered her robes around herself and fled back to her room. Flinging the doors of her wardrobe open, she wrenched out a new set of robes and buttoned them up as rapidly as possible. Then she wrapped her arms around herself as an additional sensation of security, of decency. She was better than this. She wasn't going to let her psychological survival instincts trick her into falling for a monster, into wanting the attention of the person responsible for starting the war, into being receptive to the man who had murdered her friends. She couldn't let her mind rationalize into falling for her rapist simply because he wasn't as much of a monster to her as he could be. She couldn't. She wouldn't. Wouldn't. She could bear being betrayed by her body. She wouldn't let herself be betrayed by her mind. She'd rather break it. She had to get out of the manor. She pressed her hand against the cold window and stared despairingly across the moonlit estate. Then she drew her head back and smashed it into the glass as hard as she could. The unbreakable pane didn't break, couldn't give. She drove her head into it again and again and again, and there was blood streaming into her eyes, but she kept going. Again and again. An arm closed around her waist and clamped over both wrists as she was dragged away from the glass. She fought, trying to pull her hands free, digging her toes into the grain of the wood floor to push herself back, sobbing. Granger, don't! Malfoy's voice was close to her ear. She pulled futilely to free herself as she sobbed and sobbed. She was so tired of being hurt and alone. She wanted to be done. If she kept existing in that house, she was going to try to find solace. Anything but being cold and alone forever and ever. She wanted to be touched. She wanted to feel safe. Even if it was simply an illusion, she wanted it. But she couldn't. She wouldn't betray everyone like that. Harry, Ron, Minerva, Ginny. She wouldn't betray herself like that. I can't, she sobbed, trying to break free again. Don't hurt yourself. Granger, that's a command. Do not hurt yourself. Malfoy growled the order as he pulled her further from the window. She kept struggling. Stop! The order was a snarl. Stop trying to physically injure yourself. His voice was shaking. She felt the manacles around her wrists grow hot as he invoked them, and she struggled against the magic. No! She sobbed as she felt the magic grow until it almost smothered her mind and her body went limp. She slumped against Malfoy. He released her wrists and wrapped his arms tightly across her shoulders, as though he expected her to suddenly fling herself against the window again. She just stayed there, shuddering and quietly sobbing in his arms. There was blood sliding down her face and dripping from her lips and chin onto the floor. So, he said in a tense voice after a few minutes, you found a way around the manacles, I see. As she hung against him, she realized dully that she had. The compulsions existed in her mind. The order was not to hurt herself, but didn't specify any difference between psychological or physical harm. So, in a state of sufficient mental agony, she had been able to bypass it. She was hurting either way. She couldn't stop her mind from hurting her. The compulsion had been nullified. It was always in her mind. Her interpretation of the compulsions had always been what had limited her. The command to be quiet, this is so important. She had interpreted it as Malfoy not permitting her to speak without permission because she assumed he would be vindictive like that. So she hadn't been able to speak. If she'd interpreted it as something simpler, like not speaking loudly, she could have spoken, unless Malfoy had clarified and specified the compulsion further. The compulsions were built upon preventing willful disobedience. When she wasn't thinking about the fact she was disobeying, when she was reacting instinctively or speaking without thinking, she'd always been able to get around the compulsions. She simply hadn't noticed it. I suppose I did, she said quietly, regaining her footing and standing. His hand slid away from her. Something inside of Hermione twisted at the loss of contact. He turned her and used a spell to remove the blood from her face and cast a healing charm where the skin had split. Her head was throbbing where she struck it. Why? Malfoy asked in a hard voice. Why the sudden need to go so far? She looked at him. They were standing only inches apart. His steely gray eyes were studying her carefully. He'd taken a sobriety potion since he'd kissed her. She could smell it on his breath. Why not? She said in a wistful voice. The options have always been escape or die. But this is the first time you were actually intent enough to manage it. Why tonight rather than yesterday or the day I left for France? So he had noticed that she'd become unwillingly responsive. Hermione's mouth twitched and she turned her face away, pressing her cheek against her shoulder. Don't talk to him. He's not your friend. I don't require you to speak to get the answer, he said after several minutes. Although I would think you'd prefer it. We are due for a legamancy session after all. Hermione pressed her mouth shut, but her eyes flickered over to her bed. She didn't want to lie in a bed in front of him again. If he invaded her mind to get the answer, he'd see how pathetically, desperately lonely she was, how significant he had become to her. If she answered the question, she'd have some control over the narrative. She opened her mouth several times as she struggled to where to begin. She felt so cold her skin hurt. She hugged herself, rubbing her arm slowly. I think I'm beginning to develop Stockholm Syndrome, she finally said quietly. It's a muggle psychological condition, a survival instinct or coping mechanism, I suppose you could say. She fell silent and glanced toward Malfoy. He was expressionless, apparently expecting her to expound further. She turned away. He sighed with irritation. So we're doing this the hard way. Very well. Legamancy, then. Hermione stiffened and curled her shoulders in defensively. It's something that occasionally occurs when a hostage can start to become attached to their captor due to their dependence. She forced the words out, her voice shaking. She didn't look at Malfoy. She forced herself to continue. I don't know much about it. I didn't have much time to study psychology, but I think I'm starting to rationalize your behavior, trying to justify what you do. A lack of cruelty becomes kindness. It's a survival mechanism. So it operates through subconscious reactions and adaptation. In order to try to make an authentic emotional connection, I might develop feelings for you. Her voice broke and trailed off for a moment. There was a pause. Honestly, I'd rather be raped by your father than have feelings for you, she finally said, staring at the blood on the floor. It was a resounding silence, and she saw Malfoy's hands curl slowly into fists at his side. Well, he said after several seconds, with luck, you're pregnant now, and you won't need to suffer the attention of either of us. You'll just be left alone. He started turning to leave. Without thinking, her hand darted out and caught hold of his robes. He froze. She sobbed under her breath even as she gripped the fabric tighter, dropping her head and resting it against his chest. He smelled like moss and cedar, and she shook and burrowed against him. His hands rose up and rested on her shoulders until she could feel the heat of them slowly sinking into her, his thumbs lightly running across her shoulders until she stopped shaking. Then his hands stilled, and he shoved her away violently. Hermione stumbled back and nearly fell against her bed as he drew away from her. His eyes were cold, and there was something unfamiliar in his expression she couldn't place. He stared down at her for a moment, his jaw twitching. Then he drew a sharp breath and gave a soft, bitter-sounding laugh. You don't have Stockholm Syndrome, he said. He raised an eyebrow. You don't care about surviving. Gryffindors are always eager to die. His lip curled into a sneer as he said Gryffindor. After all, you've always been fantasizing a grand murder-suicide for the two of us for months now. No. The thing that's eating you isn't surviving. It's the isolation. Poor little healer with no one to take care of, no one who needs you or wants you. Hermione stared at him as he continued. You can't bear being alone. You don't know how to function. You need someone to love. You'll do anything for the people that let you love them. That was what the war was for you, wasn't it? You wanted to fight, but you were smart enough to know another foolhardy 17-year-old duelist wasn't going to change the outcome of the war. Not the way a healer could. I don't imagine any of your friends ever even appreciated that, did they? That the choice was a sacrifice for you. Hermione felt herself pale. Potter and the rest of your friends were too stupid and idealistic to appreciate those choices you made. Quite a burden, being one of the few people smart enough to understand what was necessary to win. one of the only ones willing to actually pay the price that victory demands. They never appreciated any of it. You let them send you away. Then, when you came back, you let them work you to death. Not much value or glory for healers. Not like fighters. Even Ginny realized that. When Creevy died, they gave Potter days to grieve just because he saw it. You were the one who tried to save that boy. And what was it you got? 4 hours and you were expected back on shift again? That's not how it was. Hermione's hands were clenched into fists so tight the bones hurt. That is exactly how it was. You may delude yourself, but I've spent so many hours inside your memories. I probably know them better than my own. You would have done anything for your friends. You would have made all the... I'm gonna cry, sorry. You would have made all the hard choices and paid the price without complaint. Hoard yourself for the war effort. But do tell me, because I'm sincerely curious, what did Potter ever do for you to deserve it? She glared up at him. Harry was my friend. He was my best friend. Malfoy sneered. So? Hermione looked away and drew a shuddering breath. I never had. I never had any friends when I was growing up. I was too odd, too bookish. I wanted them more than anything, but no one ever wanted to be my friend. When I found out about Hogwarts, I thought it would all be different, that being a witch was why I'd never fit in. But when I got there, I was still odd and bookish, and no one wanted anything to do with me. Harry was the first person who let me be his friend. I would have done anything for him. She gave a dry sob under her breath and swallowed it. Besides, it's not like there was any chance for me without him. There was a long pause. That is the most pathetic thing I've ever heard in my life, Malfoy finally said, straightening his robes. So, what? I'm your replacement Potter? He scoffed. If anyone so much as speaks to you, you can't help but latch onto them. Nocturne alley prostitutes cost more than you. Hermione's jaw trembled, but Malfoy wasn't done. Let's be clear, mudblood. I don't want you. I never wanted you. I'm not your friend. There is nothing that will bring me more joy than being done with you. I know, Hermione said in a low, hollow voice. Although, Malfoy said after a pause, I can't deny you've improved on me of late. I've sent Stroud my thanks. He raked his eyes across her body. Hermione drew a sharp breath and glared at him. Then he scoffed. Really? That's why you kissed me? Because of the potion? He shrugged and stared at her mockingly, eyes cold. What can I say? Rape isn't really my thing. However, your growing attachment is both fascinating and amusing to experience. I never imagined you'd be the sort to fantasize that my mandatory care of you indicated some sort of attachment. I can't even begin to guess how amused the Dark Lord will be to witness it in a few days. Potter's mudblood falling for her Death Eater rapist. I don't think it was possible for you to be more pathetic, but apparently with mudbloods, there's always a lower point. He turned to leave, but then paused. I'll be back later to deal with your memories. Please don't assume that I'm dead because I occasionally have a better use for my time than wading through your tragic little life. He snorted one last time and stalked out of Hermione's room. When he returned the next day, Hermione had barely moved. He stared at her for several minutes. She didn't look up or acknowledge him. Bed, he commanded. Hermione stood without a word and seated herself on the edge of the bed. She stared down at the floor. He didn't even need her eyes. There was a moment of pause before he forced his way into her mind. He spent most of his time examining her memory of Snape. He barely skimmed through her recent memories. When he caught up to the present, he withdrew and left without a word. Hermione felt dead. If she'd looked in the mirror and found that she was a ghost, she would have barely been surprised. Cold Nothing. That was all that she was left. She lay in bed and mouthed apologies to her friends for failing them all. When Stroud arrived 6 days later, Hermione wordlessly crossed the room and seated herself on the edge of the exam table, mechanically opening her mouth to the Veritaserum. "You're looking rather gray," Stroud said, her mouth quirking faintly as she studied her. How did the conception effects go this month?" "I don't know. Isn't that why you're here?" Hermione said in a bitter voice, staring down at her lap, rolling the fabric of her robes between her fingers. Stroud gave a cold laugh. "Clever." There was a pause as Stroud cast a pregnancy detection charm. Then a longer pause. "You're pregnant!" Stroud's tone was triumphant. Hermione's hands stilled. "No. Please. No." It felt as though Hermione had been abruptly forced deep under freezing water. No air and pressure, as though she were being crushed on all sides. She could hear her heart rate surge up until the sound of her blood roaring was almost all she could hear. Stroud started speaking, but Hermione couldn't make out any of the words. She couldn't breathe. Stroud was speaking to her more and more loudly. The words were rounded and indecipherable. Hermione gasped and tried to draw in oxygen, but her throat felt compressed as though she were being strangled. Her heart was beating so hard there was a sharp stabbing sensation through her chest. "No, please, no." Stroud was standing in front of her, staring into Hermione's face. Stroud kept saying something again and again. The movement of Stroud's lips was the same each time as the healer drew closer, gesturing. Hermione couldn't make out the words. Stroud's expression was growing visibly impatient as she kept repeating herself. The sound just garbled together into an indecipherable roar. Hermione couldn't breathe. Her lungs were burning as she tried to. The edges of the healer's face were blurring, as though she were bleeding into the surrounding air. Everything was growing blurrier and blurrier. There was a sensation of needless sinking into Hermione's arms and hands. Suddenly, Malfoy was in front of her, his hands on her shoulders. "Calm down." His hard voice cut through the blurring. "Breathe." Hermione gasped, drawing a ragged breath. Then she burst into tears. No, don't be pregnant. Give her to Lucius. Let him rape and torture her to death." Every time she drew in a breath, it felt as though there was a knife being dragged down inside her esophagus. "Oh God, no!" She sobbed the words over and over as she shook. "Breathe. Keep breathing," Malfoy said. His expression was drawn. His jaw clenched as he stared down at her and watched as she tried to draw breath. It took several minutes until she stopped, merely dragging in stuttering inhalations, and gradually began inhaling and exhaling alternatively. His grip slowly loosened, and he slowly turned to glare at Healer Stroud. His expression was enraged. "You know she is prone to panic attacks. You cannot spring information on her," he said in a furious voice, still holding Hermione firmly by the shoulders as she continued crying. "I thought the panicking was slowly caused by open spaces." Stroud folded her arms over her chest and raised her chin. "Given how terrified she is of your father, I thought she'd be relieved." "Perhaps try thinking more," Malfoy said icily. "I am beginning to suspect that you are intentionally traumatizing her. You threatened her with my father and dosed her with an aphrodisiac without warning. Are you trying to cause her to have a mental breakdown?" Healer Stroud snorted as she cast a diagnostic on Hermione. "I'm not doing anything that risks compromising her memories. There's no need to concern yourself. I've been quite anxious over their recovery ever since I realized she was the one responsible for Sussex." Stroud eyed Hermione coldly. "I'm curious how a witch who never even graduated Hogwarts and without any formal training single-handedly constructed a bomb capable of killing all of my colleagues." There was a long pause, interspersed by Hermione's broken sobs as Malfoy stared at Stroud. She was a resistance terrorist, trained throughout Europe to become a healer, specialized in deconstructing curses. Not to mention that she had a potion mastery. If she could take apart and neutralize a curse, she could also use it. If you'd been so curious, you could have asked me, he said in a cold voice. Psychologically torturing her is not going to give you answers, particularly since she has no memory of it. Your program is not an opportunity to exact revenge. You appear to have forgotten that I do not suffer fools tampering with her. I wasn't. You were. The Dark Lord placed her under my care. You were aware of how precarious she is. I've gone to considerable expense and effort to maintain her environment. Given that Dark Lord made no objections when I executed one of his marked followers for interference, do you really think he'd trouble himself over you? Stroud's pallor grew deathly. My program is a farce. Malfoy sneered as he says it. The reason you didn't die alongside your colleagues in Sussex is because your proposal failed to qualify as scientifically sound enough to qualify as a laboratory there. Where are your controls or your statistics and historical data? The spectacle you're so willing to provide the society pages is funded and staffed to easily carry on without you. Malfoy's eyes glittered viciously as he spoke. This is the only warning I'll offer. You are no longer permitted to be alone with her. Today's appointment is over. If you have new instructions regarding her care, you'll give them to me. Topsy! The house elf appeared with a crack. Malfoy didn't remove his eyes from Stroud. Escort Stroud to the drawing room. I'll be down when I'm done dealing with the situation here. Stroud huffed, but she was still pale and her hands shook as she gathered her files. As the door shut, Malfoy turned back to stare down at Hermione. She had stopped crying and was trying to breathe steadily. He gave a low sigh and then pulled her to her feet. Come, he said as he led her across to the room to her bed, studying her carefully before reaching into his robes and withdrawing a vial of dreamless sleep draught. Considering recent events, I'm afraid I don't trust you conscious and alone. Take this. Hermione extended a leaden hand and accepted the vial, but then stared down at it hesitantly. Her breath kept hitching. Some potions can result in fetal abnormalities. I don't remember whether dreamless sleep is safe, she said in a wavering voice. It's fine. She glanced up at Malfoy. How on earth would he know that? He met her eyes. I was concerned something like this might happen if you ever got pregnant. I verified it. She continued to hesitate. I'm not asking. If you refuse, I will make you, he said in a hard voice. Hermione pressed her lips together and swallowed hard as her chest continued to stutter. She unstoppered the vial unsteadily and brought it to her lips. As soon as she swallowed the contents, she choked and burst into tears again. The vial slipped from her hands and plunged down onto the floor, shattering. Oh, God! She sobbed into her hands as the potion hit her system and overtook her mind like a black tidal wave. She sank onto the bed. Oh, God. Oh, God, please. Her eyes slid shut as she continued to cry. She was dimly aware of her legs being lifted up onto the mattress. Darkness swallowed her. I'm sorry, Granger. That is the end of chapter 24. All right, guys, how are we doing? We're at the end of chapter 24, and we are on the final chapter of volume 1 of Manacled. We are about one more. This is rough. I told you guys this whole thing it's an uphill battle. We are 10 pages exactly from the last chapter of volume 1. This is chapter 25. Home stretch, guys. I know it's brutal. I promise I'm not reading you as something as pedestrian as the Stockholm. Just stay with me. You got this. Okay. Home stretch. One more chapter. Chapter 25. Exactly, Addie. I would never leave you guys on a... Okay, let's keep going. Chapter 25. When Hermione opened her eyes, it was late evening. Turning her head, she found Malfoy standing in front of the portrait on the wall, speaking to it in a low voice. The witch in the painting immediately caught sight of Hermione's movement and gestured over his shoulder. He stopped speaking and turned on his heel to stare at her. He looked tired and singularly unenthused by his impending fatherhood. Hermione felt as though she were going to be sick. She squeezed her eyes shut, curled into a defensive ball, and tried not to start crying again. She could hear the clip sound of Malfoy's shoes as he crossed the room and approached her bed. There was a long silence, and she could feel his gaze on her. She tucked her chin down against her shoulder and willed him away. You are not allowed to hurt yourself or do anything to cause an abortion or a miscarriage. It was not a statement. It was a command. She could feel the flush of the heat around her wrists. I'm sure you'll try to rationalize it as being protective in an attempt to get around the compulsions, but it is not. You are not allowed to do anything to end your pregnancy. She could feel the prick of tears in the corner of her eyes and sobbed faintly. Topsy will be monitoring you full-time now to ensure you don't experience any misfortunes like tripping on the stairs or chewing on a sprig of yew. She's cared for pregnant witches before, so she's well aware of what you can and cannot eat or drink. She has my permission to immediately restrain you if you try anything. Hermione didn't say anything. Malfoy remained standing beside her bed for several minutes before he sighed faintly. She heard his retreating footsteps and the click of the door. She stayed in bed and alternated between crying and sleeping, curled up tightly, wrapping her arms around her stomach protectively. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, she whispered again and again. I would do anything to spare you from this world. Malfoy reappeared after 4 days. You cannot lie moping for 9 months, he said. You need to eat. You should go outside. Hermione ignored him and hoped he'd leave. Unless he intended to force her from bed, she had no intention of moving. There was a long silence. She could feel his eyes on her. I have something for you, he finally said. She felt something heavy press into the coverlet and cracked an eye open. There was a thick book laid beside her. A guide to effective care in magical pregnancy and childbirth. She closed her eyes again. I can't touch your books, she said, her mouth twisting as she spoke, and her voice shaking faintly. A story I had them all warded against mudbloods. This is not from the Manor Library. Malfoy's tone was faintly amused. It won't burn you. There was a pause. I will expect you to get out of bed tomorrow. After he left, Hermione opened her eyes again and tentatively reached toward the book, resting a finger lightly on the cover. There was no burning sensation as she came in contact with it. She pulled it closer, drawing it against her chest and holding it tightly. The next day, Hermione forced herself out of bed and went to the window. The book was brand new. The leather spine creaked slightly as she lifted the corner. The pages smelled faintly of machine oil and ink. It was 3 inches thick and printed on scritta paper. She started on the table of contents and read for hours straight. It was a medical textbook rather than a basic pregnancy guide for a lay witch. It was thoughtful of Malfoy to realize she'd prefer that. She was deep into a chapter on endocrine regulation influencing adequate trophoblast invasion when Malfoy walked into her room again. She clutched at the edges of her book reactively as he stared down at her with a contemplative expression. When did you last go outside? He finally asked. Hermione hesitated and swallowed. The day you went to France, I went outside. His eyes narrowed. For how long? Hermione jutted her jaw out slightly and flushed. Less than a minute. Irritation flickered across his expression. And before that? Hermione was silent and dropped her eyes. You haven't been outside since the equinox, have you? Hermione stared down, unblinking at the page in front of her until the words blurred. Malfoy sighed. Get up, he ordered. She stood up, clutching her book tightly across her chest. He gave another sigh. You cannot bring that. It weighs nearly 5 pounds. I'm not having you drag it around the estate. Leave it here. Hermione held it tighter. He raised his right hand and gripped his temples as though he had a headache. No one is going to steal it or take it if you leave it here. If they do, I'll buy you another one. Leave it. The final words were a command. Hermione reluctantly put it down on her bed and then went to retrieve her boots from the wardrobe. While she was getting ready, Malfoy stared out the window, studying the horizon. Then he turned sharply and glanced over her briefly before striding toward the door. Hermione followed him slowly. He paused at the door of the veranda and looked over at her. We won't go near the hedge maze. He led her through the rose gardens and then along one of the lanes lined with the blossoming fruit trees. The estate was lovely in spring. Hermione couldn't deny it, but the beauty felt bitter and poisonous as she took it in. Neither she nor Malfoy spoke until he had escorted her back into her room. As he was walking away, she managed to speak. "Malfoy?" Her voice wavered as she said his name. He stopped and turned back to her, his expression closed, his eyes guarded. "Malfoy?" she said again. Her jaw trembled as she gripped the poster of the bed. "I will never ask anything of you." His mouth twitched and his gaze hardened. She felt something inside her break with despair, but she forced herself to continue. "You can do anything you want to me. I will never ask for any mercy from you. But please, please don't hurt the baby. Even if you have a different heir, it's still half yours. Don't. Her chest started to stutter as she struggled to breathe and not start crying. She shook. "Don't let Astoria hurt it," she said in a broken voice. "Please, please." Her voice cut off as she started hyperventilating. She clung to the bedpost as she struggled to breathe. Malfoy crossed the room and took hold of her shoulders. "No one is going to hurt your baby," he said, meeting her eyes. She pulled away from him, freeing one shoulder. Don't make promises to me that you don't mean." His expression flickered and he caught her shoulder again, running his hands along her arms. "You have my word. No one will hurt your baby. Astoria will never touch it." Hermione bit her lip as she stared up at him and struggled to stop overbreathing. Her lungs kept spasming without her control. Her whole body shook as she kept dragging in sharp, panting breaths and then immediately releasing them. "No one will hurt it. Calm down now," he said firmly. "You need to breathe slowly." She leaned into his hands for a moment, resting her head against his chest as she tried to draw a slow breath. Then she froze and tore herself away from him, backing up to the wall. "Don't amuse yourself with me," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't want your promises or attention in order to maintain my environment." She sobbed faintly under her breath. "After all, you made it quite clear how pathetic I'd be to mistake your mandatory care for anything." She wrapped her arms around herself and slid down to the floor, shaking and pressing her mouth closed as her whole body shook. You needn't concern yourself further. I'll take care of myself. You needn't walk me again." Malfoy stared down at her, unmoving for several minutes, while she pressed her hands against her mouth and tried to calm her breathing. His hand twitched forward slightly before he curled it into a fist, gave a sharp nod, and left. She didn't see him again for 3 weeks. Topsy's presence grew constant. Although the elf was rarely visible, when Hermione was so much as sat up in bed, the elf would immediately materialize and ask if she wanted anything. During those 3 weeks, Hermione developed morning sickness. It arrived early and with a vengeance. Hermione could hardly bear to smell many foods, much less try to taste or possibly swallow them. Fortunately, the smells of the outdoors did not bother her. When she was not rereading her pregnancy guide, she went on long walks around the manor. She made herself walk along the hedges, reminding herself again and again that Montague was dead. She started getting headaches. It was a grinding pain that started as the vague sensation in the back of her skull, but seemed to grow slightly worse every day. When she was not walking or reading, she curled up in bed and slept. As her pregnancy continued to progress, her head began hurting so much, she began clenching her jaw subconsciously to try to deal with the constant pain. The daylight worsened the headaches. Bright, sunshiny days kept her in bed as she tried not to vomit from a combination of morning sickness and pain. Within days, the pain grew so severe she couldn't even read. Topsy added dark, heavy drapes and kept out almost all the light in the room. She ate steadily less and less. When she didn't eat or get out of bed for 2 days, Malfoy finally reappeared. She heard him enter, but didn't pull her arm away from her eyes to acknowledge him. "You need to eat," he said. Really? She said in a weak but sarcastic tone. I had no idea. The medical test book never mentioned that nutrition was necessary during pregnancy. She heard him sigh. It's a magical pregnancy, she said bitterly. Even muggles suffer morning sickness. It's just worse for wizarding folks. Even the mudbloods. There was a pause and she heard him shift. Is there anything you'll eat that you think you could eat? Chips from a greasy spoon, she said drolly. Or perhaps a bag of crisps. There was a long silence. Really? He said in a doubtful tone. She scoffed faintly, and it made her head throb so painfully it was as though someone had driven a metal rod through the base of her skull and into the center of her brain. She gave a low sob. The unending, growing pain was like having her brain slowly crushed and ground into dust. Even if I could think of anything that sounded edible, I doubt I could keep it down, she said in a strained voice. She could almost hear him trying to think of something else to say. She rolled over and cradled her head in her arms. Witches have been having children for thousands of years. Statistical probability indicates I'm unlikely to die from it, she told him. There was a pause. My mother nearly did, he said. His voice sounded hollow. Hermione said nothing else. Malfoy didn't leave. He was still standing by her bed when she fell asleep from pained exhaustion. Healer Stroud arrived a few days later. Malfoy loomed behind her like an ominous shadow. When Stroud conjured an exam table in the center of the room, he sneered at her. Walk the additional 10 feet to her bed and cast your diagnostic charms there, he said in a cold voice. Stroud huffed faintly under her breath and walked over to where Hermione was curled into a ball. Stroud barely glanced at Hermione as she cast a complex diagnostic over Hermione's stomach. A tiny orb of pale, almost blindingly bright yellow light appeared, pulsing so rapidly it was nearly fluttering. It looked almost like a golden snitch, but it was miniaturized, a little bigger than a pea. Hermione froze and stared at it. The light made her nauseous with pain, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. It illuminated almost the entire room. That is the magical signature of your heir, Stroud informed Malfoy. Hermione's eyes darted over to Malfoy. He looked rather as though someone had struck him upside the head with a bludger bat. His face was ashen and he looked half dazed. The fluttering is the heartbeat. The size corresponds to the growth of the fetus, and the brightness indicates the magical levels, which are exceptional. As I had predicted, Healer Stroud's last words were smug. Although it may make the pregnancy more traumatic for her, powerful children often do. Stroud glanced over at Hermione and gave an insincere smile. Stroud spent several minutes casting various spells on the orb of light, and Hermione finally she cast one on Hermione's head. Hermione looked up. The glowing lights scattered across her brain all seemed the same, except there was a faint tinge of gold to the light. Healer Stroud turned towards Malfoy. Have you checked her memories recently? I have not, he said. She's already suffered one seizure from having legamancy performed on her when her hormones levels were elevated. I'll wait until her migraines and morning sickness pass. Legamancy is invasive and traumatic, regardless of the familiarity of magical signature. Healer Stroud nodded. It's likely the migraines are primarily due to the fugues. Headaches during pregnancy are not uncommon, but the levels of pain the diagnostic is indicating are exceeding would be regarded as normal. Malfoy's expression tightened. Is there anything that can be done? He asked. Prescribing pain relief potions during pregnancy isn't advisable. It can result in fetal abnormalities or miscarriage in the early stages of pregnancy. Stroud said, you could try muggle pain relief if you're that concerned, but usually magically induced maladies require magical treatment. Malfoy eyed Stroud skeptically. Stroud jutted her chin up. If you don't believe me, you're welcome to get a second opinion or bring in a midwife to corroborate it. The mind healer informed you that the corrosive properties were likely to be excruciating. It's not as though anyone has ever created individual magical fugues around hundreds of memories before. Magical corrosion is as powerful as it sounds. The magical level of your air is likely accelerating the process, but we don't have any idea how long it might take. It's possible that once her hormone levels rebalance, the severity of the pain will ease somewhat, but it's equally likely that the corrosion process will stay this way for the duration of the entire pregnancy. It's impossible to predict. There's really nothing that can be done about it. There are safe potions for keeping her hydrated and from starving that can be administered if she can't keep them down. However, unless she loses a dangerous amount of weight or starts screaming from the pain, interfering could risk her or the pregnancy and do little more than extend the process. Malfoy's jaw clenched. Fine. Stroud left shortly after that, but Malfoy stayed behind, staring down at Hermione. She closed her eyes and tried not to dwell on how miserable she felt and that she might stay that way for another 34 weeks. Her head hurt too much to even think. She tried to will herself to sleep. The tiny glowing orb of light appeared fluttering in her mind's eye, and she curled more protectively around her stomach. She felt the bed shift and cool fingers touch her cheek, brushing back her hair and then resting against her forehead. She bit her lip and fought against crying. She was so tired of crying. She tried to pretend it was someone else. It's Harry. It's Ron. It's your mom, she told herself. She didn't force herself to draw away from the touch. Another week, she began to wonder if she were going to die from this pregnancy. Despite the advanced science of obstetrical healing, magical intervention in pregnancy was extremely limited. Magical pregnancies tended to either neutralize or react extremely badly to external magical influences. Hermione could keep herself slightly hydrated. Topsy dosed her with hydration and nutrition potions multiple times a day, but Hermione could rarely keep them down for a few seconds necessary for her system to absorb them. She wasn't sure if she was actually suffering from hyperemesis, or most of the nausea and vomiting was caused by the migraines. If she ate anything, she would immediately vomit and then retch until she was sobbing from the additional pain it caused her head. She lost almost all of her muscle tone. She lay limply in her darkened room and wished she'd die. Malfoy came. Often, she thought. He brought several mind healers who just stuttered nervously around him and offered no helpful advice. He brought midwives and obstetrical healers who cooed over his heir's magic levels and prescribed even worse tasting potions for Hermione to just vomit up. She suspected Malfoy came sometimes when she was asleep, because her oversensitive nose would often detect his scent in the room. When he came when she was awake, she was hardly more responsive. He would sit down on the edge of her bed and smooth her hair, and sometimes he would take her wrist and pull her hand into his. The first time he did it, she thought he was playing with her fingers, but gradually she realized he was massaging her hand, tapping of the tip of his wand across it in various pressure points, sending mild vibrations into the muscles. Then he'd bend and massage her fingers and palm lightly. He was doing what healers did to treat the tremors from the cruciatus, she realized. He must have memorized the technique due to how frequently he needed the treatment himself. She didn't pull her hand away. She told herself it was only because it might make her head hurt more if she moved. As the end of May approached, her head steadily hurt more and more. She grew thinner and thinner until the manacles could slide halfway up her forearms. Topsy became fretful and began to meet Hermione's eyes as she softly entreated Hermione to try to swallow more potions or sip on some peppermint or ginger tea. Malfoy began to hover. He had to leave to hunt and perform other duties that Hermione tried not to think about, but he was often in her room. He didn't talk to her. He rarely met her eyes, but he smoothed her hair and he held her hands and fidgeted with the manacles around her wrists. Sometimes when she opened her eyes, she'd find him staring at her stomach, but he never tried to touch it. She was almost 9 weeks pregnant when she abruptly woke up panicking. There was something she needed to be ready for, but she couldn't remember. It was important. the most important thing, the thing she couldn't forget. She needed to be ready. No matter what, she was supposed to hold on. She forced herself out of the bed. The pain of being upright had her gasping. She clutched her head. She forced herself to stand. She couldn't remember. It was right at the edge. Her legs tumbled from the muscle atrophy. She forced herself to walk and tried not to panic. She was supposed to do something. Something. What was it? Topsy appeared. Is you needing anything? No, Hermione said in a shaking voice as she racked her mind and tried to think. Oh God, what was it? Her heart started to race as she struggled to remember, to think through the blinding pain. There was black spots steadily dancing in her vision, growing larger and larger. The pain in her head kept growing. Malfoy was suddenly in front of her. Did he apparate? She didn't hear it. What? He started and broke off when he found her standing in front of him. I can't remember, she forced out. I'm supposed to hold. Her voice broke off in a low cry as the pressure in her head grew so intense she thought she'd pass out. Her vision wavered. She blinked, trying to see. And when her sight cleared, she found Malfoy had a knife in his hand. She looked up at him, startled. His expression was cold and intent as he lunged toward her. She fell back, trying instinctively to ward him off. The moment before he stabbed her, Malfoy suddenly vanished. Alistair Moody was standing in front of her, grim-faced and tired. An opportunity has come up. One that could change the tide of the war. Before Hermione could say anything, Moody was gone and she was falling. No, she wasn't falling. Memory. Malfoy was holding her by the throat and slamming her into the ground. There was a punch of a knife blade sliding between her ribs. She was in the middle of a battlefield. Everyone was falling to the ground, suffocating. Harry, Ron, Death Eaters, everyone was dying around her, and she was screaming. How many times do you think I could stab you before the light goes out in your eyes? Ginny crying, I didn't mean to. Something to warm my cold heart. A hard kiss as she was pinned against the wall. I didn't want you. The sensation of her wrist shattering under an iron grip. You seem pleased to have successfully whored yourself. Happy to know you've got your chess piece locked in place. Harry was standing in front of her, pale and enraged, his face crusted with dried blood. That's how little you believe in us, then you aren't someone whose help I need. She was sitting next to Tonks, who was staring at Hermione guardedly, her eyes suspicious. How many people did you kill today, Hermione? 10? 15? Do you even know? Minerva McGonagall gripping a teacup, her voice shaking. You're no sinner. This is not the fate you deserve, and yet it seems as though you're determined to try damning yourself if it means winning. Her own voice. If my soul is the price of protecting them, of protecting you, that's not a price. That's a bargain. You're mine. You swore yourself to me, growled into her ear. Severus looking cold at her. If you manage to succeed, you're just as likely to destroy the order as save it. Hermione crying, I'm sorry, I did this to you. Finally, Malfoy was standing over her, his face white, his eyes glittering with rage. I have warned you. If something happens to you, I will personally raise the entire order. That it isn't a threat. It's a promise. Consider your survival as much a necessity to the survival of the resistance as Potter's. If you die, I will kill every last one of them. It was like falling as the past broke free, surging up through her mind and swallowing her whole. That is the end of Volume 1 of Manacled. You made it. You made it. We are officially in Volume 2 of Manacled. Here you go. You did it. You did it, Boom Coven! We made it to the end. So, now, obviously, the pregnancy, I know, it's a lot. It was an uphill battle. But now where we're at, we're going to talk about it briefly. Where we are at is now Volume 2 explains everything. You guys are going to get pelted with what the fuck is going on. What has been going on. Every memory that Hermione has been protecting is about to be unfolded. So I know that the trauma and triggering things that happened to Hermione, I know many of you have said, how can this ever not be terrible? You are going to find out. And I hope that you guys know that the story unfolding, because I really feel like Volume 1 sets you up for what you think is, it's just nothing that you can think. So, it's like a movie. Collie Guy, I'm glad you're here. I wasn't sure we were going to survive. I know. I wasn't sure any of us were going to survive it. Listen, Manacled Volume 1 is penance for Volume 2 and 3. You know, you won't appreciate Volume 2 and 3 if you don't get through the absolute slog of shit that is Volume 1. So, any thoughts, any ideas that you want to share before? Thank you. I know this was a longer episode, but I wasn't going to leave you guys on a cliffhanger. Anything you guys want to share before we close out this episode? Any thoughts? I'm sorry, I didn't really read the chat this much because we had just so many chapters to get through. So if you have any questions you want to ask, you can ask, and we'll add this in the aftercare. This is the aftercare part of our chapter. I still think he's on her side secretly. Just remember, he's bad. Okay, so we think that he was secretly on her side. That was like a movie. I think what's interesting about where we are now that we're beginning Volume 2, Jesus, is that now you guys get to, you know, now it's like, in some ways, we've been looking, the book Manacled is through the POV of Hermione, obviously, and we are looking through the looking glass, and even Hermione has had no idea what's happened to her, what's been happening to her. She is a product of the memories she has protected and also of the trauma she's endured now. So what's really exciting that I hope you guys look forward to, and that I think is one of the, why Manacled is better than the original Harry Potter, the story is what I truly believe would have happened if it wasn't written for children. And what I think we're going to discover is that the Hermione in the books and the movies original, she was my favorite character. She still is. Manacled is going to make you, I'm going to cry. I think the way that Hermione is written, and you guys are going to see it and finally get to it, she is probably one of the best fucking characters I've ever had the pleasure of getting to be in their brain. I'm very excited for you guys to get to like see Hermione in a different light, because we're really looking through a very traumatized person right now. So this is really exciting. I'm kind of confused about the last memory. Julie, no. So what's happening is that was Hermione is pregnant. We knew all along. I'll explain that. That's a really good question. So I'm going to explain the last memory. So the last memory, or really it's not a memory so much as a flooding of memories all pouring out of her at once. So basically what happens is we knew that Hermione getting pregnant was potentially going to unlock her brain. Did we know it was going to happen so quickly? Did we know it was going to happen so violently? No. Hermione is pregnant. She has a very, very, very powerful baby brewing in her. And that pregnancy basically slowly eroded the protective magic and busting open all of her memories at once. So when I'm reading you, you're seeing flashes of Hermione talking to Ginny, getting yelled at by Harry, and then I'm gonna read this again because I think this is a very important thing. We hear, you know, Minerva talking to her, Professor Mooney, like all these people talking to her in these flashes of memory. And we have Malfoy saying, I have warned you, if something happens to you, I will personally raise the entire order. That isn't a threat, it's a promise. Consider your survival as much a necessity to the survival of the resistance as Potters. If you die, I will kill every last one of them. And all of these memories are things that people said to her that she protected. Why would she protect these memories? What was the significance of these memories? We're gonna find out. But that last moment was the busting out the floodgates of all of her memories at once. And they don't come out pretty. They don't come out seamless. They come out like a flurry of like someone doing like a flip book kind of thing. So that's what that last memory was. It wasn't one memory. It was a flurry of potentially 20, 30, 100 memories all pouring out at once. So I know that's a little confusing but let me also just say, just so you know, you guys know the deal. Manacled Volume 2 immediately starts as a flashback. So a lot of Volume 2 is going to be laying the groundwork of what all of that is. Up until Umbridge brought her to Voldemort, didn't Draco think she was killed? Right. So there's a lot of things, very good, Addie. There's a lot of things to contend with. If you have any other questions, I don't want to give anything away because we've worked so hard to get to Volume 2. Volume 2 we will start obviously next week. But if you have any other questions, you could also always put it in the comments on YouTube, and I'll go through them too. Realistically, this is going to be slowly an unpouring of all of Hermione's memories. So we're finally there, Poop Coven. It's all going to make sense. It's all going to have been worth the pain and the trauma. If you have no other questions, I'm going to close out this episode of Manacled. If everyone's good, and then we are going to do pins, and then we are going to do family dinner pictures. Rapid fire. So if you guys are good, I am good. I'm so grateful for everybody who listened. All of the previous episodes of the Good Girls Club, if you would like to catch up, all of them are on YouTube. They will all always go on YouTube. So if you want to like hear all the nitty gritty that got you to this chapter, go give a listen. Also, our next episode of the Good Girls Club, for anybody who's like really eager and busting at the seams to get to the next one, which I hope you are. The next date of the Good Girls Club episode will be another Friday. So sorry to all my smutty Saturdays. Next Friday, the 30th, will be our next episode because Saturday is a daytime stream. So I know, Elle, I'm so sorry. I really feel like it's very painful, but maybe I'll do an extra episode now that we got through Volume 1. I'll give you 2 episodes next week. But either way, the online live reading will be next Friday, and maybe I'll give you guys a bonus episode to hold you over. You've worked so hard. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening to Volume 1 of Manacled. I hope you've somehow enjoyed the journey. It really is gonna be worth it, and you're gonna know everything so soon. Thank you, and we are going to go do all the other Poop Coven things. So thanks for listening, and hi to all of our YouTube friends. I love you. You are wonderful. All right, and out of the Smut Hut.